Welcome to Aflame for Christ, homilies to set your heart on fire with love for Jesus Christ. My name is Father Joseph Gill, priest of the Diocese of Bridgeport, Connecticut, and you've joined us on this feast of Saints Peter and Paul. On the day back in 2005 when Pope Benedict was elected, and Benedict came out on the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica, and the cameras were looking all over the place, near Pope Benedict was Cardinal Francis George from Chicago. And the cameras caught him with a very distant look on his face. He was looking kind of mystified by something. So later on, some reporters found him and they asked him, Cardinal George, what is it that you were looking at? What was it you were thinking when you were standing there right next to Pope Benedict? And he said, I was just thinking that here we are, gathered in the spot where St. Peter was martyred, that he was crucified upside down by the Emperor Nero, who thought that he was destroying this cult of Jesus Christ. And yet, here I was standing next to the 265th successor of St. Peter. And where is the successor of Nero now? My friends, God chose two very weak, ordinary men to be the foundations of his phenomenal church, right? We've got Peter, the fickle fisherman who denies Christ. Paul, the arrogant tent maker who, before his conversion, put to death Christians. And yet, precisely by God's grace, the church was built upon these two men to show that the church is not merely a human institution founded by a committee or by someone with a bright idea, but rather that this is a work of God who used men transformed by grace to build his church. Peter became the first pope. Paul became the fearless apostle, going to the ends of the earth and writing 13 books of the New Testament. And so it shows us that the church is built upon these weak human beings, and God is in it, that God is the one motivating and animating the church. Today, I'd like to mention 4 ways in which the Catholic Church has changed human history, built upon these two simple apostles of Peter and Paul. First of all, it's because of the Catholic Church that we have the understanding of human dignity. Back in the ancient world, life was, as the philosopher Hobbes wrote, nasty, brutish, and short. You think about the way in which people were treated, right? Women were property in much of the ancient world. The disabled were left out in the field to die. The poor were considered as accursed by God and abandoned by him. And it took the Catholic Church and their vision to see each and every human being as having a value because they're made in the image and likeness of God. And yeah, it perhaps took centuries, but what we take for granted now is something that came from our Catholic roots, that every human being has dignity. Back in 258, the Emperor Valerian launched a great persecution of the church, and he heard about Deacon Lawrence, who was one of the 7 deacons of the Church of Rome, and he knew that the church had all kinds of what he considered wealth and riches, probably gold chalices and vessels and priceless works of art. And so he called the Deacon Lawrence in and said, you have 3 days to bring me all of the riches of the Church of Rome. And so Lawrence said, all right, I'll do that. And he went out and gathered the poor, the blind, the lame, widows, everyone else that the world had rejected, and brought them to the door of the emperor's palace. And when they stood there at the door, he said, behold, Valerian, these are the treasures of the church. Now, Valerian was not very impressed, and he ended up martyring Lawrence by having him grilled alive. But the very funny story, as he's being grilled alive, he famously quipped, turn me over, I'm done on this side, right? But this is precisely the understanding of the church, that these people are not throwaway. These people are actually deeply precious in the sight of our Lord. And even less than a decade prior to that, in the great plague that struck Rome in 251, when almost 5,000 Romans died every day from that plague, Christians were able to put that value of the human person into practice. Because any rich Roman was able to get out of town. They wanted to leave that plague-infested city. But what did the Christians do? They stayed, and they ministered to the sick. Not only their own sick, the Christians' sick, but even the pagans. In fact, listen to the words of Dionysius, one of the early church fathers who was writing about that time period when he wrote, heedless of the danger, they took charge of the sick, attending to their every need and ministering to them in Christ. And with them departed this life serenely happy. Many, in nursing and curing others, transferred their death to themselves and died in their stead. The best of our brothers lost their lives in this manner. The heathen behaved in the very opposite way. At the first onset of the disease, they pushed the sufferers away and fled from their dearest relatives. Now, you might think that's just pious talk, but even the pagan emperor Julian bore witness to it when he wrote, "It is disgraceful that the Christians support not only their own poor, but ours as well. And all men see that our people who practice the ancient Roman religion lack aid from us." He was embarrassed that the Christians took care of both Christians and pagans, while the pagans didn't even care about their own. Which brings me to the second great glory of Catholicism and how it's changed the world, is that the Catholic Church is the largest social service organization on the planet, feeding the hungry, sheltering the homeless, taking care of the needy. But we're more than just a charity, because Christians serve because we see Jesus in one another. It's a very famous story that one time a reporter was observing Mother Teresa taking care of a smelly, dying man. And the reporter said, "Mother, how are you doing that? I would never do that for $1 million. And Mother Teresa said, "Neither would I, but I would do it for the love of Jesus." And that's the distinction, right? Is that Christians are not just another NGO, not just another charity. We do it for the love of Jesus. Another time, Mother Teresa said, "Wash the plate, not because it is dirty or because you're told to wash it, but because you love the person who will use it next." It is love that sets Christian charity apart from a government handout or philanthropist. And it's love that's made Christians do a great good for the world. Back in the 1940s, a young man from Washington, D.C. by the name of Aloysius Schwartz was preparing for the priesthood, and he went on a little retreat, and there, kneeling in front of a statue of Our Lady, he prayed, "Mary, I will do anything that you ask me to do." And so later on, as he's living out his priesthood, he's reading these reports right after the Korean War about the tragedy that really struck Korea. As a result of the war, almost 50% of the adult population was homeless and unemployed. And so, very moved by the plight of these poor Koreans, he asked for permission and received it to go and sail over to Korea to take care of their needs. And when he landed, he was completely unprepared for the sight that he would see. He saw elderly people picking through the trash for a little scrap of food. He saw children whose ribs were visible because they were so malnourished. He saw sick people literally laying in the streets because there was no hospital to take them in. He was so overwhelmed, he didn't know where to begin, but he started writing back to his friends in the United States, asking for funds where he could start a charity to help the poor. And so he did, and was very successful. He founded an orphanage and a way in which the poor could be fed. And then he started one not only in Korea, but in the Philippines and in Mexico as well, serving over 200,000 children who were orphaned because of these wars or other tragedies. But towards the end of his life, he became stricken with ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease. And as he knew his life was short, he instructed his friends, he said, "Please write on my tombstone, 'Here lies Father Aloysius Schwartz, who did his best for Jesus.'" And right now, his cause for canonization is open. The organizations he founded are still going strong today in these countries. But it was really because he did it for love of Jesus. He didn't do it for just simply to alleviate a need, but because he saw Jesus in these poor people. And that's what sets a saint apart from just a mere philanthropist. You know, a third great impact of the Catholic Church in the world is that it was the church who really led to education and knowledge being widespread. You know, you think about pretty much any branch of knowledge, from law to medicine, from philosophy to astronomy to art, the Catholic Church has had a hand in it. And sometimes there's this view that the Catholic Church is against science, or that science and faith are somehow mutually exclusive, but that couldn't be furthest from the truth, right? It was the Catholic Church that founded the university system. It was the Catholic Church that came up with laws of evidence. The Big Bang Theory, for example, was invented by a Catholic priest, Father George Lemaitre. Did you know that the Vatican owns and runs a state-of-the-art observatory to look at the stars, all the way in Arizona, of all places? Right? The Catholic Church has always been at the forefront of learning and knowledge, because we see that any kind of knowledge, whether it's scientific or religious, all leads to the good Creator. You know, Thomas Cahill, a great historian, wrote a very famous book recently called How the Irish Saved Civilization. And it talked about how when the barbarians came into the Roman Empire, they were illiterate people. So what did they do? They burned down libraries. They have no use for books or learning. And so they destroyed a tremendous amount of knowledge and history. But it was these Irish monks, simply scribes who were working day by day to copy books in the terrible climate of Northern Ireland in this cold. that really kept knowledge alive. And once the barbarians had receded, they could bring that knowledge then to the rest of Europe. And so the world was not left merely in a dark age, but a place where learning found fertile ground. But my friends, I think more important than anything the church has done on this earth is the fact that the church leads us to heaven. You think about the way in which the church's mission has gone to the ends of the earth to bring souls into relationship with Jesus Christ. That's why the church exists. And think about the number of saints that we'll never even know about, souls that are in heaven. Think about the number of rosaries that have been prayed throughout the centuries. Think about the ways in which the church has been a conduit of grace and how people have encountered Christ here. Think about the simple, humble souls that receive the Eucharist every single Sunday. My friends, the billions upon billions of people who have brought into a relationship with Jesus Christ through the Catholic Church, this is the greatest triumph of Catholicism, because it's not merely to change this world, but to lead this world to heaven. All right, so what's our takeaway from all this? 2 things. First of all, be proud to be Catholic. We know people like to talk a lot about the sinners in the church and the scandals of the church and how the church falls short. But my friends, be proud that everything that's good in the world has its origin and its roots in our Catholic faith. We have every reason to hold our heads high because we are part of the only religion that Christ promised would last until he comes again. As he promised that in today's gospel, right? That the gates of hell will not prevail against his church. But secondly, consider how you are called to contribute to the great work of the church. Because the church is not just priests and nuns. The church is each and every person, baptized person, who is listening to this right now. And so that means that we have a duty and an obligation to contribute to the good works of the church, to evangelize by bringing more and more souls into heaven, and to live a holy life ourselves, that we may be numbered among the great saints. My friends, it's amazing how God used these 2 weak men, St. Peter and St. Paul, and by the power of his grace alone, brought about the Catholic Church, which now numbers in the billions, leading souls to heaven day by day. In the same way, can God not take our ordinary lives and by his grace transform us into saints, outposts of the church right here in Monroe, Connecticut?